Okay. Perhaps now is as good a time as any to get started. Thank you all very much for coming this evening. My name is Shimon Bassar. I'm the co-curator of the exhibition Can Buildings Curate. I also teach here at the Architectural Association. This evening we're having a performance debate, as you well know. This is one of 5 commissions that have been made for the exhibition. Just maybe one or two words about the intentions of the show as a whole, and how then this performance has sort of come about, and how, in my opinion, what purpose that fits. The primary objective of the exhibition is to, as it were, act as a kind of discursive instrument. The claim that we make is that since the late 60s and the 70s, the dominance of the modern white setting has, as it were, created a kind of whitewash, a kind of amnesia towards earlier 20th century forms of experimentation, where the gallery space was a site of curatorial, architectural, and indeed artistic experimentation. The whitewashing of the modern gallery space literally smothers, or has smothered, many of the debates and the discourses, indeed the provocations that people like Duchamp, Kiesler, Herbert Bayer, Alexander Dorner were practicing during the 20s, the 30s, the 40s, right into the 50s. Obviously, since the advent of installation, site-specific installation art in the 70s, in a way, the significance of the exhibition as a kind of curatorial instrument in and of itself is something that has been on the wane. The site-specific artwork is exhibition design and statement and curation in and all together. So, given that the exhibition doesn't in any way, I hope, attempt to proclaim a kind of zeitgeist, I don't think there's any such thing possible anymore. What it does hope to do is make certain kind of connections between what has happened, perhaps for some people what feels like a sort of deep and distant past now, and what is happening now, and hopefully what might yet happen. To that extent, the idea or the notion of kind of commissioning a piece that really dealt at a discursive level with these issues was very important for us. And in particular, one of the things that that this evening we'll be looking at is this kind of love-hate relationship, what we call a love-hate triangular relationship between the artist, the architect, and the curator. And our thesis is that the viewer, upon arriving at the gallery, upon arriving at the museum, is beholden to the kind of to the synthesis of practice that the artist, the architect, and the curator together orchestrate. Envy, love, jealousy, hatred, even, all have taken place in the gallery. And coming from a sort of architectural background, I'm well aware of the kind of battle of egos that take place in terms of who gets top billing. This evening, even though the plaques that are on the table denote gold, silver, and copper, which was purely accidental, I promise, there is no such hierarchy, I hope. I'd like to introduce and welcome Barnaby Drabble, Hinrich Sachs, and Isa Sturm. Barnaby Drabble and Hinrich Sachs set up Drabble Sachs, which is a cultural research and action group, in 2001. Barnaby Drabble is a curator and has been, since 1998, curating a show which is currently touring called Curating Degree Zero. He teaches at Goldsmiths at the École des Beaux-Arts in Genève and the curatorial studies program in Le Magasin. Hinrich Sachs is an artist and writer and teaches at the Jan van Eyck Academy Maastricht. I'd known about the work of Barnaby and Hinrich for a couple of years and was very interested in a series of discursive pieces that they'd been holding at a series of art institutions that was really looking at the kind of the abstract mechanics of the art world and of the art industry. Isa Sturm is a partner in Sturm Wolf Architects, who have been together since 1998, who have completed numerous projects, but I'd like to, one that is particularly germane for me is a project they did, worked with Laurie Anderson at the 2002 Expo. The performance will take between 45 minutes and 1 hour. It's being recorded, and then the recording will become a permanent piece within the exhibition next door, as indeed this specially customized table is. I'd like to make a deep thank to Art Review, who are sponsors of the event this evening. And in particular to Rebecca Wilson, who's been extremely supportive of this whole thing. And I'd like to remind you, perhaps at the end of the evening, if you haven't done so so far, please pop next door into the exhibition as you immediately on the left. There are complimentary issues of Art Review, and there's a very nice piece by Jay Merrick on the show. And please pick up also one of our handouts. Who says we don't give you anything for free? So, with that, I'd like to welcome Drabble Sachs and Isa Sturm. Thank you.
Great. Well, it's the man with the dubious pleasure to have been awarded the bronze medal on this particular table you see in front of me, with my colleagues here with silver, and then, of course, the architect with gold. I also have the joy of starting. You know, it's like the loser's speech, where I have to warm everybody up until the point where the winner can really claim all the glory. I was kind of interested in precisely this idea of there being a hierarchy, not being a hierarchy, and particularly in terms of an idea of visibility. Whenever I go to drinks parties or dinner parties outside the art world or the cultural world, and people ask me what I do, when I say I'm a curator, they really don't have a clue what that might mean. Whereas obviously, if I'd said I was an artist or an architect, there would immediately be a long list of stereotypical and probably quite false attributes which they would be able which would spring to mind. So I started to think and build what I'm calling a polemic on art, architecture, and curating, which I will deliver with meaning and vigor in a second, around the idea of the invisibility of the curator and his place in bronze medal position here tonight.
Just a second, as this is a real-time performance, a question to the technical team. Is that okay with the open window for the recording?
It's okay.
Okay, fine.
We might start to see the screen kind of waving back and forth, which would be quite interesting. Well, okay, I'm going to start reading this paper. For the greater part of the last century, the curator's job was precisely to practice invisibility. Architects built galleries and museums to reify and even perhaps to deify the artistic process. Artists made the objects to fill these neutral spaces, and curators hid skillfully behind the scenes, in the office, in the store, but not in the public eye. Within the Enlightenment paradigm of the art exhibition, the work of the curator has been hidden from the public, and even within art circles themselves, it's been systematically voiced as an administrative task. Why? Well, because the idea that an exhibition has been made, that someone is selecting these objects, that someone has considered how and when they will be shown, and that this consideration is based on subjective, not objective grounds, is fundamentally offensive to the myth of artistic excellence. And this myth is at the very heart of the Enlightenment project. The Mona Lisa. This myth is at the very heart of the Enlightenment project because art is excellent. Art is good for you, and art will make you a better person. In this project, the value of an art object is built on the basis of its inherent excellence, a truth which ties itself to the quality of the singular genius artist. The work itself looks inwards to this core of brilliance. It's a puzzle, closed off from all its surroundings, and the spectator is asked to approach with care and contemplation, to unlock this encapsulated wonder and achieve a moment of personal epiphany. The architect of the Enlightenment Museum does everything they can to sustain this differentiated universe. Whiteness, evenness, and neutrality are their tools to this end. And the curator adds to this with the lie of their own invisibility. These objects have not arrived here, for in these spaces they are to be considered placeless and timeless. There are no other objects, better or worse. There is no motive behind these objects, purely artistic expression. No subtext, just the viewer's interpretation. There is just excellence. And excellence, of course, cannot be constructed. It just is. Just as an artist cannot become a genius, they're born one. To adopt an overused but seemingly fitting term, art under these conditions is entirely fetishized, like some holy relic. It transcends its own objecthood and detaches itself from its time and place, to stand in for something much larger than itself, but through itself. It is the modern equivalent of the saint's bones, the toenails of Christ. But hey, let's lighten up. The Enlightenment project is over. It's been over for ages, for better or for worse, and it's clearly dead and buried. And with its death, we have to assess the true terms of its life to better understand the nature of the new project that has replaced it. To paraphrase the Danish curator and critic Simon Sheikh, in a neoliberal understanding of culture, enlightenment has been superseded by entertainment. I think he's right, and that a short, sharp look at the most celebrated of our museums and galleries today shows us how the state, arm in arm with a rampant art market, willing sponsors, opportunistic artists and curators, and a poorly informed public, have dispensed quite willingly of all philosophical aims for art. We are witnessing the slow Disneyfication of the art experience. This is an image I pulled off the internet. A Korean family recently returned home from their holidays. The process itself, this process of Disneyfication as I refer to it, is marked by subtle and barely noticeable changes. And what's interesting is the extent to which the ghost of the Enlightenment project lives on, and how well the new entertainment project has taken the trappings of its predecessor as a leitmotif, an empty signifier of a new kind of ultimately very marketable value. This is why I chose this photograph, because essentially she's, rather than facing the artwork here, her back is turned to the artwork, which becomes a backdrop for her existence in the museum, which I think sort of kind of suggests precisely this shift I'm describing. When we visit art museums and galleries, what confronts us still looks like art, and the spaces themselves continue to signal to us that it must be art. We stand in front of these things and simulate enlightenment, but to my mind, we're faking it. We're not transformed, we are comforted. We are not being enlightened, we are being paid off. It's a cozy match. For the supporters of art becomes symbolic of investment in creativity of the citizens and in this thing called culture. And for the citizens themselves, a visit to the museum or the purchase of their first painting becomes symbolic of the idea that they are cultured. It's a trade-off, and one in which neither side has to change themselves in any meaningful way. The exchange itself denotes progress, but affects stasis. We're running to stand still. A little bit of product placement there, for those who can see me. We're running to stand still, talking up the social importance of this thing called art, while simultaneously stripping it of any radical or transformative potential it ever might have had. So let's get this straight. Any art exhibition today that uncritically simulates this old Enlightenment paradigm is a toothless lie. It's a sheep in wolf's clothing. Architects who build spaces for art objects, artists who make these objects, and curators who select and display them need to understand that this is the new role now asked of them. They need to understand that they are working for Disney. So with that in mind, What we might do today is to consider what a career in simulation really means, what possible futures for art such a process offers, and what alternatives exist. And to explore a little deeper into this process, I want to take an example, and of course it's a very, very familiar one. Giles Gilbert Scott's defunct power station at Bankside, transformed under the hands of the architects Herzog and Dimmeron into a museum for modern and contemporary art. It's a key global example, one we all know well in London, and interestingly, with a link to the Swiss, given the nationality of the architects. Hailed as a massive success after receiving approximately 50% more visitors than forecast in its first year of opening. Considered and endlessly cited as an icon of London's importance as an art capital and a major tourist attraction in its own right. But what is really going on here from the perspectives of the artist, the architect, and the curator, and the visiting public? Who wins and who loses in this development, and in what ways? Sorry, I've got a really sore throat today. I did a lot of shouting at the opening yesterday. I propose that Tate Modern is not what it claims to be. It is, in fact, not a museum of modern art. It's a representation of a myth of a museum of modern art. So with Disney in mind, we might liken it to a movie. Herzog and Dimmeron are not only the architects in this production, they're also the artists and the curator. They are auteur directors in the old style. In Tate Modern, the artworks in the collection and on temporary display are incidental to the narrative of the building. They are really the faceless crowds of extras in Herzog and Dimmeron's epic. They lend authenticity to the space, and they theme the visitor experience. Tucked into the most cramped and uninspired spaces in the building, the art is left firmly in the background. It functions purely as a subplot. The curators at Tate, and I know many of them, are no longer the invisible civil servants of the public museums of the past. They do have names and faces. They write lengthy, worthy wall texts, contextualizing their selections. They give talks and radio interviews. But to be truthful, no one's listening. Everyone's in the shop buying Tate coffee mugs, on the rooftop restaurant enjoying the views over London, or schmoozing in the members' lounge. The curator is here invisible for a quite different reason. Previously, you see, no one knew who they were, and now no one cares. Previously, this invisibility served a purpose, but now it's a sign of redundancy. The directors don't need scriptwriters. This is a blockbuster. It's a star vehicle. A script is unimportant. So where are the public when they're not in the shop, the cafe, the restaurant, or the many spill-out zones? They are, of course, in the turbine hall. And many of them never get any further than that. And here, in a nutshell, we see the ghost of the Enlightenment project mapped neatly onto the entertainment template. How gigantic and neck-craningly ambitious this space is. With its gargantuan ramp and bridge effect, it is power architecture in the mold of Spielberg. As you descend the ramp into the space and then clamber the stairs to the bridge, only to look down onto those following you as they spill backlit down the ramp like little aliens leaving the mothership in Close Encounters of the Third Kind. But what came first, the turbine hall or the Unilever commissions? I mean, I'm interested to know this question, the chicken and egg question. When was that decision made? To leave this vast space unfilled would have been a risk, and so enter the powerful commercial sponsor for this pièce de résistance. And the turbine hall becomes the ultimate expression of the singular contemplative object, made up of the container and the contained. This is fetish on a colossal scale, an exercise in shock and awe. The artists selected for this prestigious opportunity can necessarily only come from the cream of the art market's stars, supported and proven as they are by their commercial backers. The public, on the other hand, are reduced to ants. Small insects gawping at the monumentality of the space and its contents, reduced to a chorus of oohs and ahs. The redundancy of the curator, and here I'm getting miserable again, is made cruelly clear here. There is no place for them in this one building, one work model. Out of necessity, in this huge space, all the commissions are architectural in nature. And with Tate Modern, it is the architects who are jubilant. Herzog and Dumoulin take home the Oscar for Best Picture. In 1992, the artist and theorist Michael Lingner wrote in his text about the end of the art exhibition and exhibition art. There are no longer spaces that might be considered generally predestined for exhibiting art. Art has become placeless and must, in principle, be able to happen everywhere. The whole of the public space has become a space for art. All that remains open to art is to choose between various public spheres, each of which has its own conditions for communication. Today, art no longer lives in works, but through communication about productions called works. How right he was. On the one hand, the Turbine Hall, let's go back to my Turbine Hall here. The Turbine Hall shows exactly how well the architects and their partners at the museum understand the power of communicating with bold images and supersized production values. How good they are at bread and circuses. But the values Tate Modern alludes to are not those that it practices. Although the Tate's publicity uses quotes from Joseph Beuys, the Vienna Actionists, Donna Haraway, and Lucy Lippard to market its activity, the Turbine Hall model denies the possibility of social sculpture, for example. As Beuys puts it, a conception of art revolutionized to the degree that it can turn into a politically productive force. Similarly, it erases all possibilities of dematerialization in terms of Lucy Lippard would use. And it also excludes Otto Mühl's calls for an art of blasphemy, obscenity, charlatanism, sadistic excess, and the aesthetics of the gutter. In this museum, what we are left with is empty spectacle and shopping. So, to conclude this polemic, and it was fun to sit in a bath and make this up, Lingner offers us another reading of art as communication. And this is one not of might is right, but one of contingency. Art, he says, is placeless. It must happen everywhere. It must dissipate. It must collaborate. All museums and galleries that continue to favor an architecture of separation, awe, and objecthood are the natural enemy of such practices. The challenge for curating today, I believe, is to work together with artists to totally reimagine what sites for art might be, and to negotiate these sites in collaboration with various publics. Architects, of course, understand site too, and they should be involved in this radical project. But they will need to question the primacy of physical constructed space. Site will need to be unbuilt. In short, architects need to stop trying to contain art and let art contain them. That's the end of my rant. Thank you for listening. As a sort of slide to problematize or raise this question about containing and being contained, I chose this image of Robert Morris's piece from 1965. This is a remake. He made many of them. I think they exist in practically every collection now. Mirrored cubes, which are also known as mirror cubes. 4 of them here in a space. I'm not sure which space this is in. To my mind, Morris was one of the first people to work with an idea that maybe the object could start to contain its surroundings, and that's why I chose this slide.
And you want us to intervene here?
Yeah, let's go into free-for-all mode for a while.
Yeah. I think this is a pretty good example when we were kind of somehow trying to relate our bits and pieces before preparing. I wasn't so much surprised to see this image coming up because my first example, and you will see that afterward, actually is a paraphrase of this work in a much more contemporary setting. Maybe you can just pop it in, or how do you imagine?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think, Isa, did you have anything you wanted to add about Morris? Or are you happy at this stage? Or do you want to argue with me about anything I've said?
Yeah, it was so direct against the architect.
Well, I was told that I was here for war. I came prepared, you know?
We should hate us. So, no, I think it's difficult if you begin to speak about container, because that's a vision of space which is very restrictive. So it could be also another vision. It shouldn't be. It doesn't have to be a container. So if you say art should contain architecture, it's not better than architecture contains art.
Okay.
I think it's not very good if architecture is a container for art. That's maybe a bit old-fashioned. We have other possibilities to make spaces.
But most of the works still deal with that logic. They accept that.
I know, but we are looking for new other possibilities. Or, for example, this exhibition from Schumann and
George,
George, that's not like that.
Yeah,
we are working in a different way.
I suppose that's why we came back to this idea of the mirror, and to what extent the two might reflect one another, rather than one be contained within the other. But the question of containment, I think, was also not necessarily one of physical containment, but maybe also a way that particular discourses at particular times in history appear to encapsulate the others. And I think when we look at the monumentality, which architecture, the role of monumentality, which architecture plays now within our growing and developing cities, it really has, to a certain extent, encapsulated or contained a lot of what was previously understood within a sculptural discourse, an idea of sculpture in the public space or commemorative sites. Now appears to be the mantle seems to have shifted. So it's maybe also this idea of the areas we cover, rather like our table here, which has this very nice kind of divide between the three of us.
I'm always with my papers in your area.
Have you been in my area? Hold on a second.
In yours. Oh.
So I think when I mentioned the word contain, I don't mean just physically. And I think that's probably also why I mentioned Lingner, which is an idea of a post-exhibition art, which is certainly informed by an idea of conceptual art, or art as idea.
Yes, but on the other side, you have been choosing a work which is from the 60s or early 70s, and I think we have had a way. We have been making some kilometers on the path, and so I'm kind of trying to identify a little bit better your ball played into the camp, into the side of the artist that is no longer. Well, if I understand you correctly, you are asking from the artist not to produce objects anymore.
No.
I am, to a certain extent.
You are?
Yeah, I think so.
And that's why you have chosen Morris.
Well, I think Morris is the beginning of producing an object which is actually stressing its non-objectness, which I think is quite interesting. I mean, I think objects will always be part of it. Perhaps a question of how objects reflect on their objecthood is kind of important. And I mean, I guess this is the beginning of a long series of works, or I know it's the beginning of a long series of works, which try to reflect on context and moment and on... I mean, the other work of Morris we might have shown is the box filled with the sound of its own making, which is a wooden sound sculpture, which when you listen to it, you hear the sounds of the saw and its preparation. So this reflexivity, I think, is quite interesting, because it does criticize its own objectness, its own fixedness. Well, I think so. Yeah.
Yes, but on the same side, they're pretty dull, no? I mean, this type of autoreflexivity, I mean, we know it by now.
We know it by now.
We got it.
But maybe we need to go back in history a little bit and find out whether we haven't forgotten certain parts of that, or just take that for granted these days.
Okay, so let's do it this way.
Okay.
Because I think that's how I see the link. I mean, I haven't prepared a written paper. I think I choose the role of the artist here. I do it a little bit more freestyle.
Okay.
And I have some notes on my paper here. And the first distinction I wanted to make was that, of course, we could talk in some way about the artist in relation to architectural space, or we could talk about the artist in relation to the architect. I mean, that was something that, for me, was a subtext of your question, somehow. But I'm going to concentrate in my first part on the first aspect, so to speak, leaving the relation to the curator for later, and focusing on what I would call the general attitude of generations of artists, how to deal with architectural space. And I think this Robert Morris example is a good one insofar as it is transitional. It leads, or it shows a perspective of that generation of artists towards the next steps. And the piece I want to allude to is a piece which was actually not executed by Daniel Buren in 1971 in the empty center of the Guggenheim. And this was, at that time at least, a scandal because artists like Richard Serra and I think Saunier and some others of that generation decided to boycott Buren's piece because it was preventing the viewer to see their pieces. Actually, he had planned to hang a large, extremely big canvas with his trademark stripes in the center of this void.
Atrium.
Yes, atrium. So this piece was never realized, and as time goes by, you can see that invitations come by too, and so he's invited now to have a major retrospective in that same space. And of course, he's not so dumb and is interested in going to finally do that piece or execute that piece, but of course he's doing something else. And surprisingly, he's working with the kind of idea of a mirror cube, which is bigger than would be bigger than the building of the Guggenheim itself. So what is seen inside this atrium is a corner of that mirror, and you can see it a little bit on this newspaper. It's very recent critique. And I, of course, use this example of Buren to illustrate one of the two attitudes that artists have taken since dealing with architectural space. And Buren, of course, Buren's practice is an excellent example of site-specific work, dealing with the architectural space in several layers and addressing them. Another example where one could say this goes even a step further, maybe even into the dissolution of the visibility of the work or emerging with the architectural space, is a piece here by Jenny Holzer in the Neue Nationalgalerie in Berlin, the Mies van der Rohe building, where she kind of highlights with her text, how would you call them,
Streams.
The existing architecture, playing upon the reflections in the night in that building, so basically leaving it empty. So somehow a perfect marriage, one could say, but maybe a trap. The other approach, and unfortunately I haven't been able to have give you a good picture here of that same generation of artists, is to understand the architectural space rather as a scenic decor or a prop. And just to, well, give you an example, I'm especially thinking of Rebecca Horn, who in 1987 in Münster used a defunct tower, old tower in the old part of the city, and installed her work Gegenläufiges Konzert with a kind of dropping water in the center and some ostrich eggs and things like that. But basically, the installation was based on the qualities of the site, not transforming that, not addressing to that site as an architectural space, but as an imaginary, as a prop, I think, an imaginary space. Well, I think we are a bit further, and when I say we, in this case, I'm speaking here for all these generations of artists.
That's what artists are allowed to do, though, isn't it? Speak for all of the generations before them.
I just used the word trap, and actually I would give you my reading, what could be understood as the two prevailing traps. And one of them, as I understand it, is to see or to perceive the architectural space actually as the artist's friend. That is what is best illustrated in the case of Jenny Holzer. So this merging, where you don't make a difference between both, could actually become a trap. The other logic is to understand the architectural space as the artist's enemy. That's where they will not meet in the night, where they kind of pass in the night. How big Sam Francis would ever create his canvases, they will never match the architectural qualities and the conditions of the building of the Neue Nationalgalerie. It's just not a space for painting. So a painter of this kind, and of course other artists in his line, somehow are neglecting or fight the architectural space. Maybe a contemporary example to neglect or to fight architectural space would be Thomas Hirschhorn. So to completely fill it up, so you would not recognize any element of that very space. And this is maybe underlined through a quote from a catalogue he published a few years here in London, 1998, where in the text it's a clear reference to Buren, not surprisingly apparently. In this text it reads, "Upon the invitation of Comme des Garçons, this conceptual artist designed an entry pavilion for their Tokyo boutique. A well-chosen title, Comme des miroirs traversés, or like the transverse looking glasses, contextualizes his stripes trademark with the lustrous demands of the specific site. As a nod to his sponsor as well to Lewis Carroll, Buren plunges himself down the rabbit hole of fashion. Along with a growing number of late modernist heavyweights, he has joined his peers in fulfillment of the critical scriptures. Their formal strategies of repetition and reduction have imploded under their own logic. In what was once packaged as a campaign to critique conventions of visuality and authorship, they have realized their destiny as an extended armature of corporate advertising and marketing." So there is this kind of dissolving thing, and one of the possible answers is Thomas Hirschhorn filling the spaces. Of course, there's also there's also a trap on the side of the architect, to my mind. And this architect's trap seems to be the well-intended idea of what art is, and to create, therefore, exhibition spaces for this art. As an example, I show you this shot of the recently opened Álvaro Siza Serralves Foundation in Porto. This is actually the first show in this space, and you see there a collection of arte povera. The obstacle from the perspective of artists and curators is apparently the window. So in the meanwhile, this window has been closed due to the requirements of artists and curators. I have asked a friend to take a recent shot of this closed window, actually 2 weeks ago when the new Rem Koolhaas was opened, and he said, well, I visited the place and they just reopened the window.
When you say closed, you mean
it was closed, there was no window for time being.
They walled it up.
Yeah, they walled it up, yes. Okay, let me sum this up with a question: what kind of options have been developed artistically to leave this permanent zone of conflict and reconciliation? And I have selected a few examples, somehow trying to give you an idea of what I think are strategic and meaningful perspectives developed by artists in the 90s, which work with something what I would call doubling the architectural space. And there comes in the mirror element. If you remember the the installation of the work by Olafur Eliasson, of course he was working with the mirror element too. There was a mirror ceiling. On the other side, this strategy includes a shift from the architectural space to a discursive space. I think this is best shown in the fact, or best illustrated to the fact that the piece is called The Weather Project, and to my mind, the real container of the work, the real space of the work, is the publication. The publication is actually the place where the discursive side of the piece is developed. It was not really recognized as the weather piece if you would have asked people in the street. They were, oh yeah, the turbine hall, or whatever, the sun, but not the weather project. So on the side of the artistic strategy, I think one can show that the publication is becoming the decisive and crucial part of where the work is located. Of course, this uses classic strategy of pointing at the absent, in his case, the absent place of nature. I mean, this is totally normal strategy in the artistic realm, since Richard Long has introduced the same kind of strategy in the generation of Buren. And on the other side, it introduces this space of the publication, introduces also the communication, the space of communication, so using interview, using surveys or statistics or trigger questions to open up a different space, not the architectural one, but the communicational space. Another strategy has been to create one-to-one copies of existing architectures. This is an image of a project I did in 1995, or I proposed in 1995 to the Museum of Africanic and Oceanic Art in Paris with Jean-Hubert Martin. Actually a commission which then was not executed due to some cultural political reasons, but it was based on the idea to create a one-to-one scale duplicate of the collection of West African art and to offer that to contemporary artists from that same area to be used. Rickert Tiravanija did a similar piece, or did a piece with the copy of his apartment shown in the Kölner Kunstverein in 1996. And you would visit the apartment, the replica of his apartment in real scale, and you could use the bathtub, you could cook, you could go there watching telly. And the opening hours of the Kunstverein were prolonged until midnight. But this exactly used this same logic of the one-to-one copy. Just as a recent image of his work in his show at the Boijmans van Beuningen, a kind of retrospective show of Tiravanijah's work, he's going a step further. He's actually doubling the architectural space where he has been showing works. So this is the reference to a show in the Wiener Sezession. So this space remains completely empty. It's in the Boijmans. What we are seeing is the Boijmans in Rotterdam, but it represents the central space of the Wiener Sezession.
And these spaces were completely built in, I mean, the copies? The
copies are built in. In this case, these are metal columns. In the case of the Kölner Kunstverein, he made a wooden construction, and the 303 Gallery from New York was also rebuilt in that kind of same logic. The second element I think I need to mention is that you would have a guided tour or an audio guide that is telling you the works that you don't see, leading towards the communicational space again. So in this case, architecture becomes here something like a temporary signifier. Of course, there's always another strategy open to artists, and it is to totally neglect spatial dimensions in favor of what also has been described as a performative turn. As an example, I show you this image. Asta Gröting is, since 1993, in an ongoing series of works with ventriloquists, writing scripts, offering to them, and then they are performed by these ventriloquists. Actually, the doll that you see is a representation of the artist. Okay. I tried to give you these examples in order to make a little bit more understandable that from the perspective of the artist, who is, of course, encountering a commodification, a shift towards the entertainment, there is a need to assure the value and the meaning not only of the single work, but of the oeuvre. And these are strategies actually to deal with that. I'm wrapping it up with that what happened to the work of Elofe Eliasson. It appeared on the front page of The Guardian. And I think this is a good example of rediscussing this issue of in which space does the work happen, and where is the very location of the work at the moment. Where is this space? And as I already mentioned, the Weather project wasn't recognized as the Weather project, but through images like this, rather like a painting, one could say. We are left here to discuss, or it's up to us to discuss to where this could lead.
Yes, you are looking for another space, for the discursive space, the space of communication. And with your examples of Dublin, you can reach that. But what is with the everyday space when you are coming to a museum, when you are coming to the exhibition, and all is another thing, and the exhibition was getting just a little bit bigger with the doubling of the space, but the gap between everyday and the space of art is not resolved.
What do you mean by the everyday? I mean, do you mean the gallery space is an everyday space?
Yes, it should be a part of my everyday. I want that if I see art, it should be a part of my everyday's life, yes.
Well, that's a very interesting thing in relation to the experiences of the turbine hall, and to come back to that example is how casually that space is used by publics in London, really crossing the threshold, although it does strike these kind of oohs and ahs. It's done quite casually, not sort of with a feeling of entering the museum in the old ways. So there is this kind of there is this tension in that main space. A lot of people hanging around or reading the A to Z, or flipping through Time Out, and it does have something rather everyday. One thing which occurred to me is the fact that this is sort of private space masquerading as public space, which also sort of slightly concerns me. How the everyday in itself is sort of being eaten into by particular concerns, but still simulating certain things for us. So I'm not quite sure whether the everyday is something I would lobby for in the same way that you do.
Is the everyday for you an architectural issue or a curatorial issue?
No, tough question.
I don't know. That's no. It's my life.
Okay.
And if I am looking to art, so I want to see something, and which I can put into my life, no? Also. And then I have a problem if I'm coming out of the city into a space which is sometimes so different and has nothing to do with all these realities, or I can't connect with that. I think the idea of the Tate maybe is also an urbanistic one, that this turbine hall had to be a real big attractor in the city to attract people to the museum. Maybe isn't it the problem that art is exhibited in this space? Would it be better if there would be no art? And
it would be honester. I think more honest, as a strategy if there wasn't art in those spaces. But it would then, unfortunately, shatter this, as I described it, representation of a myth of a museum, because part of that myth is that art is there. So to remove it would have been sort of like an ultimate sort of, it would have been the ends of the museum, to bring Douglas Crimp into this, you know. It would have been so apparent what a betrayal of an idea of a museum this was if the largest space was left empty. But I mean, one might argue that somebody like Beuys would have thought that was the perfect use for a space of this kind, and that actually, you know, a social space in itself is artistic. So it's a difficult one to answer. What do you think?
Well, I was just thinking about the turbine hall. I mean, outside of your polemic that the artists already decided who are able to or who should exhibit there, of course this is a perfect space for exhibiting, but in the sense of having all the artistic freedoms that one can imagine. But of course that does not touch the let's say, ideas of the architect, as one can even see in the publication of Olaf Eliasson. There is this interview where Jacques Herzog is saying, oh no, I don't like your ideas about how you deal with the space. Yeah, there is the old conflict. That is what I tried to sketch before. There are these two in a kind of a fight.
What didn't Jacques Herzog like about his proposal?
Well, that the Jacques Herzog director's cut wasn't respected any longer, and Olaf Eliasson became the film director.
Ah, I see. Okay, yeah. So this is a Hollywood battle of egos going on there.
So I mean, I think we are pretty far here from every day, in that sense.
In that sense, yeah. Yes.
But just one thing before we move to Isa's presentation, I think I would question whether this space is really as free as it seems. I would question the idea that size offers more freedom for artists. And as I mentioned in my polemic, it's this question of, in a way, the only possible response to something like that, of that size is architectural in its nature. It will be an architectural form of artwork, both in terms of the scale which is necessary, the engineering which is necessary to fill this in some way. And even if you decided to go for something ultimately very minimal, that would then, of course, immediately make everybody look more at the space. So again, the architects are in a sort of win-win situation in a space like the turbine hall.
Especially if Unilever is the sponsor.
Especially if Unilever is the sponsor.
Yeah, so I will read a bit because of my English and because of, I want to say that artists show realities to an audience who wants to perceive them directly. That what I meant.
Oh, okay. Important.
For example, in a gallery space, built by architects and conceived by curators. It is here where art and everyday life get synchronized. So I hope it's explained a bit better. Now, I want to shift from a formal point of view, which we had now, of the gallery space to a more dynamic process of its production. An arrangement to test 3 gallery spaces is suggested now. These gallery spaces should be ephemeral architecture, experimental architecture, or transformed architecture. Their design should date back to a declining era of a great style. And they need to stick to the 3 following rules. Number 1, without audience, no gallery space. Number 2, curators, artists, and architects are actors. Their roles are dynamic, their competence is professional. Number 3, the concept is also the risk management. At the starting point, the result is unknown. So the first arrangement is a project for the Expo 02, the Swiss National Exhibition, initially conceived as a social installation by the Swiss artist Pippi Latheurist and completely rejected by the established School of Swiss Architecture, which recommended not to make a design for that. For this Expo 02, we designed the federal project Who Am I? In a close collaboration with the New York multimedia artist Laurie Anderson and the Swiss art historian and publisher Jacqueline Burkhardt, both best connected in the contemporary art world. It was developed in a 1-year process of numerous tests and workshops, and the results were always compared with our concept. The roles of authorships were changing daily, but the skills remained in professional hands. The idea of Who Am I was to move the visitors smoothly into an alpha status, that they could perceive themselves and their environment in a daydream. The visitors are attracted by a surrealist blow-up of a turf brick with 12 black entries. They arrive into a dark space with the ambient sound of Laurie Anderson. In the space is an island with a huge bed and 60 cushions to lay down. Contextual images worlds are flickering on the ceiling of 1,200 square meters, where the visitors see their images, and a kind like their superego appears. At once they become object and subject of the exhibition. For the theme, Who Am I?, we designed the turf brick as a non-architecture, meaning no recognizable architectural style, nor signature, nor brand. As a construct, it is tuned symbiotically with the other components of the project. These were the image, the light, and the sound of the artist. And art and architecture point out the 4 elements of life as their theme. Earth and water for building, Laurie Anderson's sound as air, and her picture world as fire. In such a microcosmos of art, architecture, design, and visitor are interacting closely. And Who Am I? The architecture, this project, in this project, the architecture plays the role of the performer. The second arrangement is the Palazzo del Tè in Mantua. It was transformed from a horse stable into a pleasure palace in 1524 to 34. Initiator was the Mantuvian prince Federico Gonzaga, who spent his years as a prisoner of the Pope in Rome. He assigned Giulio Romano to his court, who was the favorite and most talented scholar of Raffaele Sanzio, to build up a small Rome in Mantua. Giulio was painter and architect at the same time, and knew all the important artists of the Renaissance as well as their works, skills, and assistants. He was not like Michelangelo, who was a genius, being architect and painter. He had really 2 roles. From far away, the Palazzo del Tè appears as a classical Rinascimento architecture, covered with the usual surface of ancient columns reliefs. But in the courtyard, the facades fall out of order. Triglyphs slip down, dressed stones are swelling, and we see destruction and the collapse of the painted architecture in the Sala dei Giganti, which is interestingly the last room. The interiors of the enfilade discuss the metamorphosis of the Roman writer Ovid. Giulio, in collaboration with the savants, writers, astronomers, historians, etc. of the Gonzaga court, interpreted these writings for the architecture and the art. Each interior space has its own specific atmosphere, but there is always a suspense, which Ernst Gombrich in his dissertation about Romano interpreted as a sign of mannerism. The sensual Sala di Psyche, for example, where the festive banquets took place, is painted with a crowded ancient landscape. The ornamental decoration with golden acanthus leaves deceives the reading of the architectonic space and its transitions. On the ceiling, in the middle up, we don't see it very well, is a dizzying Soto in Jew, which is prolongating the space into infinity. They painted in 30 centimeters, 100 meters of space. That's a Soto in Ju. Giulio played around with the very restricting rules of the classical perspective, which are really restricting, to illusion and simulate spaces which awake and sharpen the imagination of the visitor, in this case of Gonzaga, his lover Isabella, and all their guests. The Palazzo del Te is a cinematic scenography, a dreamlike journey staging the metamorphose of architecture into painting. In this case, architecture together with painting plays a double role in the trompe-l'œil. The third arrangement is the Art of this Century Gallery in New York. Peggy Guggenheim decided 1942, it's not 24, as write it there, it's 42, to show her collection in a gallery space and commissioned the Viennese architect Friedrich Kiesler, whom we know now. During the 1 month design phase, Kiesler lived together with Marcel Duchamp in the apartment. He had also an international friendship with artists, architects, and intellectuals, and was a convinced antagonist of modernism. Peggy Guggenheim was married to the surrealist Max Ernst and owned important works of Cubism and Surrealism movement, Kiesler's friends. The Art of this Century Gallery was a transformed tailor shop. There were 4 different spaces: the abstract gallery with a blue underwater world atmosphere, the daylight gallery with the painting library, and the kinetic gallery with the work of Marcel Duchamp, La Boîte en Valise. An enlarged spiral was used as a wheel, here by Peggy Guggenheim, to turn diapositives through a very small case. The highlight of the Arts of the Century Gallery was to install paintings, sculptures, and objects of the Surrealists in a curved and concave space architecture, definitely giving up the white wall. Kiesler emphasized the relationship between the works and the visitors by a close distance. Kiesler himself sits very relaxed in between surrealistic paintings and objects as if it was his own apartment, aiming at the closer connection between architecture, art, and viewer. Vision and reality become the everyday. Therefore, he invents the colorless furniture, a multifunctional design. In this image, we see it used as a seat and for presentation as a pedestal and as an easel for the paintings. The furniture is a tool to interact with the space, the design, the exhibits, and the viewer. The original design, the cell as he called it, of the coralistic furniture had 18 extensible basic functions, which I don't show now. Here are only 4. Kiesler's manifest and concept of the correalism, word construction of correlation and realism, was the complete interaction between art, architecture, and design, where man is regarded always in the focus. Architecture is integrated in a role play, and therefore it can become a performer. In the Art of this Century Gallery, we see how architecture takes over the role of a subtle context of an inhabitable installation. So, what do you mean?
Yeah, what do you mean?
I think it's particularly interesting how topical Kiesler's become, both for architects and also for, in particularly within the curating discourse at the moment. As much as anything, coupled with this term amnesia within the criticism around the way exhibitions have been, the history of exhibitions has been constructed. One of the things which I think is problematic is the way that particular people are now being referred to as sort of, as if they were lost and now they are found. And some of the lessons, perhaps, or some of the tool-like qualities of Kiesler's displays are now being kind of replicated and also used to validate some fairly crazy exhibition practices which we see today. For me, there's a question of time, ethos, and the context. And I think one of the difficulties for me is within the question of Kiesler is this direct translation of a particularly formal approach across these decades of practice. And I guess the reason being that Kiesler's experiment dealt with art objects and only art objects. So at this stage, I mean, what his job was as an exhibition designer was to consider this material which he wanted to show. And I think, I mean, brilliantly, there wasn't a picture here of it. He even did the painting viewing room. You knew the title of it. What was it called? This one where he actually put stacks of paintings out of their frames in racks, which you could then sort of actually take out and put on an easel in front of you to have a look. So it's this incredible interactivity with these materials. The difficulty maybe, or the shift which has taken place, which I find difficult, is that some of Kiesler's more experimental ideas are now being applied to artists who generally work site-specifically, work conceptually, or work on a sort of project-based level. And that creates a very, very different effect, one in which what one ends up with is this incredible meta-exhibition where all of these roles are mixed up. And quite often, or at least as the debate leads to at the moment, when all of the roles are mixed up, the audiences naturally look for a singular author, and the one they normally stumble across first is the curator.
Is he? Or she?
Well, I think the mixing and the mixing up of the roles and the question about who's authoring these kind of experiences, I mean, with Peggy Guggenheim and Kiesler and the many artists involved in these shows, I mean, the authorship of the experience is very difficult to pin down to one person or the other. And I think that has an interesting quality at the moment in relation to breaking this idea of purity around artistic production. But simultaneously it's causing massive problems, because when artists are willing to give away some of their authorship, work collaboratively or work under pseudonyms, if the curator is then seen to be taking and absorbing that and using it to further their career, then necessarily one has to criticize that kind of activity.
Yeah, sure, but I think at least I understood your proposal, your reading of this trio here actually as a shift away from that what we had before, let's say all the types of power games, the fight clubs that are going on between the disciplines into another realm, which is more process-oriented and let's say you once used the description, the result is not known in the very beginning. Of course, then you have to also to give up the pre-assumptions about what you think art or architecture is. I think that is the biggest difference that I see here. And of course, this also comes back to that what I mentioned in the very beginning of my talk, that I did not want to focus in the very beginning on that relation between the artist and the architect, but this is one of the possible ways how to change that.
I mean, I believe that as the story goes, Kiesler and Peggy Guggenheim didn't get on particularly well. So, I think that the same battles were being fought behind the scenes as they probably are today. But certainly the production does reference all of those things you mentioned. Yeah.
But in a gallery space, you have to exist together, artists, curators, and architects. And I think you need to have some strategies to make really something better, because the art object is not alone, the architecture is not alone, and somebody should communicate this all to a public in this situation of a gallery space. And what I like is the idea that you don't have these definitions of roles of a curator, of architecture, and of what is art. And so you have new possibilities, and breaking down that, which I wanted to show with these 3 examples, which are doing that in a totally different way, and there are a million other ways too. We could reach other results, maybe.
What was your experience of working with Jacqueline and Laurie? I mean, did that happen, or did you find yourself defaulting back to your competencies? Were there any real situations where somebody did something they'd never done before?
No, everybody did all, but in the end,
everybody did everything.
Laurie couldn't design the plan. I couldn't make the film, and Jacqueline neither. So. But in the process, all had ideas, and you can say the author of this is she or she or she. It's completely, we can't tell.
And what were the working sessions like? Were you actually coming together quite frequently?
Yes, these numerous tests and workshops. So it was always 1-to-1. We were all 3 days together, and this about 10 times in 1 year. So. It was all processed in these tests.
I think it's not a coincidence that this was a girls' group. I can't. I have some difficulties in imagining this as a boy group. Would be much more tough. I mean, original constellations exist of people that know each other, or like guys that know each other from studies or whatever. Then they come up with these types of projects. But just 3 coming together and then sitting around the table.
And better here, you see. How was it for you?
How did you manage?
Well, we all have slightly different skills. Between the 3 of us, well, we all have very different skills somehow. So in the same way that you worked with your the artist and curator, that when we come together, we do offer different ways of working. So kind of that's how it works in a sense. Josh would occasionally wear a dress and high heels. I told you not to mention that.
In order to sort of work on the diversity idea. Yeah. Well, we got a bone to pick with you guys, basically, anyway, and I think we should get this underway. You want
to do this in public?
Oh, yeah. I mean, what's with this table, as we were thinking as we sat having a coffee outside earlier on? What is with this table? To give some context, when we were invited to do this discussion, we were sort of interested in the discursive side of it, and then Schumann came back and said, well, we want to build you this kind of stage, you know, we want to build you this kind of thing which represents this 3-way relationship. And I mean, we were quite busy, but these things kept on coming back slowly, more detailed, and then like these really nice pictures like this one. So we were, you know, they were quite far on, you know, and our input was like, well, God, does that, you know, well, yeah, okay, well, whatever, you know, that's fine. And then when we got here, we found this, you know, we were presented with this table, and we were talking about it this afternoon.
Oh, you mean? Sorry.
Well, I think the sort of theoretical answer is, you know, the table as a site of debate and discussion, Foucault's tableau, blah blah blah. The reality is probably, you know, the architecturally orientated part of the group simply likes designing things, and you know, it's the fetishization of the object that simply had to be there, and I know my colleagues, especially Parag at the back, very much enjoyed detailing the hell out of this thing.
Okay.
And so actually, even within the sort of triangle of the 3 of us, in a way that I think the table is a sort of manifestation, I suppose, of our 3 impulses, I think.
Oh, okay.
But I thought exactly that it was an interesting thing to find, if you want, the three of us represented when I entered the exhibition space yesterday evening. Okay, this is all clear, how we should be placed, and also this fact of being, if you want, objectified. I think that's the interesting part, that processes, I mean, we have been talking basically here about processes, communication, things like that, that all of a sudden in the space of the exhibition, there is of course a tendency to come up with the object and to accept the object as the symbolical representation of what is something more fluid, maybe. So my first impulse, I'm going to share that with you all here now, was to come up with a lighter and to burn this table. But then I said, okay, this is too artistic. This is looking like Gustav Metzger.
Yeah. I wanted to put a tablecloth over it and then a vase of sunflowers, which I thought would be sort of like, you know, attempt to get the arts back into the exhibition.
The gold medal at home to
Well, it worked then.
But we had this feeling that it was a bit sort of like the back the bid thing. This was what you were saying. I mean, it would have been probably quite good to actually have one of these rosters for, you know, the first, second, and third place, and have us delivering our talks from, you know, from these various things with medals around our necks. So I mean, in a way, when we were discussing this idea of hierarchy or this idea of love-hate triangle, you know, which initially interested us so much because of this idea of there being something competitive or there being a difference in opinion, you know, it was amusing and also kind of a point of contention to discover this table.
But was it really Lust am Design to change these three Stängel?
The three tables or the three
panels,
devices?
No, this
the tables, yeah. The legs.
The legs, yes. There were 3 legs underneath, and now it's 1. So what was that reason to change that?
We'd consulted our structural engineer, and they said that 4 was enough.
Okay.
So
We was over detailing. Yeah.
But I mean, in this kind of constellation, it looks like one might have actually been able to sort of shuffle away from the others with your bit of the table and sort of, you know, find yourself a corner somewhere if you could separate them out.
No, we decided to not give you that opportunity to go your own way and banish you to have to sit next to each other, I think. Perhaps, if it's all right with you, maybe there's 1 or 2 questions. I'm kind of keen to keep the thing going. There's one here. Perhaps you could say who you are, please.
What if we increase the triangle to a quadrilateral? And by doing that, maybe we can overcome the idea of authorship with the interaction of the audience as a 4th partner. Maybe the idea of authorship, which has been so, you know, contested, might dissolve. I don't.
Okay, you're going to have to go back to your structural engineer. This thing needs some work. We're going to need another piece.
You mean a 4th place here?
4th place, yeah.
Yes, but well, the 4th place is there.
That's the public.
I think the question, or at least the suggestion, which it is, you know, maybe, occurred to me as well when preparing sort of to think about these questions. Particularly in terms of an idea of collaboration, when one considers how collaboration develops over time, and the difficulties of time in relation to the production we're all involved in is one of how long can I be present within something which I construct. So perhaps what was interesting about the Expo project was that all 3 of you and the public, in a way, could be present simultaneously throughout the duration of the project, which was, a year or something like that. So there was this kind of simultaneous presence, which makes for an interesting possibilities of change or alteration or adaptation of the experiences. But it seems to me that the paradigm of the exhibition is very incremental. You know, we have the building of the space, the exhibitions which start and finish at particular times, you know, and also then sort of like this simultaneity of everybody being present at the same time is so rare.
But let us be a little bit more precise. I think it's what you're kind of proposing means in practical terms a synchronization of the time when public and production, in this case represented by other partners, come together. So this synchronization act, does it still allow moments of preparation before that? Or is there then only production in the moment when the public is present?
Unless it's conceived as a work in progress. Unless it's time-based, in evolution all the time.
Any other
Maybe some other
thoughts
question.
about this?
Well, personally, just to make a comment, I do not believe in the exhibition space as the one that is only playing on in the logic of the presence. But it can also work with time delay. And that means absence or things that happen earlier or later are also part of the choreography that can be experienced through an exhibition space. So that would kind of open that up again.
I think,
which doesn't exclude your option.
Yeah. I think I'd add that a number of curators, broadly now termed new institutionalists, have been attempting to program very, very process-based, very time-based programs, which don't have openings and closings. The exhibitions overlap. There are lots of live events happening within. Things are moved, exhibitions are sort of elided into one another. So one has a sense of as they describe it, often a factory space. So famously, Nicolas Bourriaud, in his book Relational Aesthetics, describes this kind of model of the way artists are working in these process-based ways sort of lends itself to a space which works in that way. But what's occurring after a while is this is becoming a hegemony in itself. But many publics are now saying, well, yeah, this is interesting, but actually, we're also interested in looking at objects. We're also interested in this variety of possibilities. So it's now reached a peak where many people are seeing people coming out of art college who feel that's the only way they can work, and that's probably working against itself in some way.
You're thinking about how to propose new ways of dealing with art, basically, or propose new art. So it seems like an endless discussion that we're never going to get anywhere, basically, because you can have several ways. I mean, one will be the three of you working together as you did with your piece. Another one will be fighting against it and doing something else totally different, right? Or like this glass box in the Guggenheim in New York. And then also trying to propose something that goes beyond. So what are we discussing? It's we're never going to get nowhere. That's my feeling after all this chat.
Okay, we've done our job. We can go home now.
I was watching your slides of the Neue Nationalgalerie go back and forth with the Tate Modern, and I realized that along with whitewashed walls, industrial settings is one of the key settings for exhibition, art, and so forth. And it occurred to me that coincidentally, for accidents of construction, the original power station and the Neue Nationalgalerie were finished within about 3 years of each other. And then again, you kept talking about good and new and exciting, and I was very grateful for your 3 slides or 3 examples, because I realized that lying somewhere between the potentially antagonistic technology, which of course is now part of the game, and the Kiesler, which actually derives from something like Wagner's Gesamtkunstwerk, this kind of moment of ecstasy that takes you out of the world, that the spectrum is really so wide, it's very difficult to get it wrong. And so how do you know when it's good? What constitutes good? Are you interesting? Or provocative? And if it's provocative or original, there seems to be 2 strands of that. One, not what anybody else is doing now, but possibly recollecting what somebody did sort of a generation ago. In which case you have the obvious problem of communication. You know, I can only be so original, or I just have no audience. I'm just, you know, you guys don't know it, but I left a pin out on the doorstep, and that's my work of art. And I just, you know, it just seems to me there's a lot going on, and, you know, that's about all you can do with it. That, you know, you have your own, you can only really answer these questions in a particular case, with a particular artist, particular theme, or particular situation, that it's almost impossible to generalize. I don't know if...
No, entirely, yeah. And one of the problems is the generalizations abound in such quantities in relation to these kind of good, excellent, you know, a wonderful piece of work, interesting, this wonderful term. I mean, I hate it when somebody comes up and I say, well, what did you think of the exhibition? Having curated something, and say, oh yeah, it's interesting. And you're like, okay, well, what can I do with that? So the specifics seem to be really, really important. But when you question this idea of how do I know if something's good, I think one of the reasons I try to bring in perhaps into my talk a kind of a political element or a political element of critique is also to question, you know, what does art do? And perhaps also to be critical about some of the more soft focus ideas which we're seeing art being asked to do at the moment, you know, to educate, to improve, to regenerate. And maybe also then to look back in history and also sort of at various things within culture at present to see a more transformative, a radical or potentially agonistic or antagonistic impulses.
And also I have to say, as a perceiver of art, as a looker, betrachter,
viewer, yeah.
A viewer of art, you are doing also a very creative activity. In a way comparable to what the artist did. So your question, how can I judge if it's good or not? That's not only, but it's also depending on your activity of looking to it, of receive, of perceive. No?
And further on, I would like to add to the, let's say, historical setting that one is in. I mean, we have prevailing notions of what we value, what we recognize as successful representations of, yeah, whatever. In this case, others are somehow less important or excluded. I think I was most amazed by the example you gave, Isa, from the kind of late Renaissance, early Mannerism, Baroque time, which of course is pre-modern. And I think that's what is happening at the moment also in other situations, that we are, of course, as we are people living in a present time, we are always relating first to the value systems we are embedded. And other value systems that are more complex or have other notions of time, I think we are experiencing that in the last years, that more and more are out there, but haven't had a place of being represented in the, let's say, dominant logic of modernism. So my favorite example, as a kind of around the corner answer to your question, how to judge, is actually the latest work of Niki de Saint-Phal. I think most of the people in the public here will be aware of her work. She actually has created a garden in southern Tuscany, and this garden might function as that what is that Gesamtkunstwerk, or that Who Am I project, a kind of total work. And the interesting point for me was that in terms of what is expected at the moment as a contemporary work of art or a contemporary work of exhibiting, one would say, oh no, that's outside, that's not valid. But it was her personal decision to do so. And I think the interesting part in her decision was to, at some point, historically step out of the logic of the exhibition machine, the exhibition system, so to speak, also to step out of a logic of modernism, of the perpetuation of styles and works, and to create something like what I could,
An
a
oasis.
selling line, a self-marketing line with all her silk screens and her neckties and all these kind of things that she has been producing to earn the money for creating that what she considers as the piece that she wants to
leave behind.
to leave behind.
Perhaps the last comment. I would just like to make a short remark on this question of these different spheres or realms that especially Drabble was talking about, the discussions between architects, artists and curators. Because what I would like, question what I would like to pose would be, do you really think that these sort of borderlines and these sort of autonomous spheres can still be conceived as such? Because in my opinion, also like Isa Sturm described in her projects, there is so much knowledge about the complexities of collaborating, there's also so much knowledge about the shortcomings of each one's position. There's so much historical knowledge about the limitations of artist practice, curatorial practice, and architect practice. So I would just like to ask if we're not at the moment able to look for practices that work on a much more complex level and that sort of integrate this sort of process, this sort of communication, and this sort of negotiation as a structural tool of creating spaces, of conceiving spaces, as a tool for thinking art differently on an institutional level also. Because the example you described with the Tate Modern, of course, it's a quite easy thing. I mean, it's a spectacular, neoliberal, huge, monumental development, and it very much is dependent on a very classical distribution of roles. And this distribution of roles, it has very much to do with old ideas of autonomy, old ideas of genius. The architect is a genius, but the artist as sort of different genius on a different level. And each of these roles is very much played out to 100%. But we also can see so much different approaches on a smaller scale, maybe different approaches that are also maybe part of the exhibition that we see over there. So, I mean, it's clear that it was a provocative statement, but on the other hand, I think we also should be on a different level of let's say, knowing about different forms of working together, hopefully.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. Of course, what you're saying is not only possible; it's current. It's happening at present, and part of what my research, which I'm doing at the moment towards my PhD, is very involved with looking at this deregulation of these roles and this breaking down of hierarchies. What I was trying to sketch out in very, very crude terms, using probably the most classic examples, was an idea of a sort of a repetitive resuscitation of particular leitmotifs from within the modernist project, which I still see as actually being dominant. I mean, you're quite right. A lot of the most interesting models are occurring in much, much smaller situations with much, much smaller impacts in publics. But when we look at the change in the importance of media today, when we consider how mediatized these kind of blockbuster incidences are, and how wholesale city development is based on the building of these iconic mediatized buildings and the images which surround them, one has to worry. I mean, one has to recognize that this is a repetition of a hegemony, and that to a certain extent it's masquerading as something which is there to set us free. But once you actually start to look a little closer, that isn't the case. So for me, it's not about being anti-institutional or attacking the large museums. I love going to these places, but it is about relativizing this hegemony in some way. And I think, therefore, it's worth, at times, getting a little bit shirty, angry, and polemic about this kind of ghost which reappears every time.
I would totally agree, but I would just think that the borderlines you talked about, and also this question of hegemony, I guess it's not so much a question of this borderline between
Yes, I'd agree.
Wonderful.
At which point,
You should have invited him. He's much better than we are.
for the sequel, he's in. No, he's in. Which reminds me, before I wrap things up, for those of you who feel that there are still questions to be answered,